Hi, everyone. So I thought that I would respond to a question that has come up in varying ways, philosophical and otherwise, over the years, and came up in response to a recent interview that I did as well. And the basic question is, does spiritual awakening make you a good person? So my simple response to that is no. So some of you can end the video here, but don't, because I'm going to get more into detail about it. The real response, the more nuanced response, is that we need to unpack what people think of as being a good person, as well as unpack this idea of this sort of pervasive moral superiority loop, which gets quite complex, but I will very much get into it and how we play that out. So if we were to start at kind of more of a superficial level and work our way down, if we were to talk about what is a good person, we have to talk about conceptualizations of normality. And basically what that means is that if we were to consider what a normal person is, I would define this as a person that is suffering under the weight of emotional repression and has a lack of basic awareness of reality. And so if I bring that definition in, uh, most of us can get to a point in our path, some of us more quickly, some of us it might take a while longer because of our experiences of this reality of understanding that no, I don't I don't desire that type of normality. We then go into kind of the understandings of a good person under a sort of capitalist system, meaning that a good person should want specific things out of their lives. They should want a house and a certain amount of children. They should act according to the religious or spiritual edicts that they are following, which gets a bit deeper. But if we were to look at the surface level for a moment, it tends to be about owning or achieving certain things in this world. Um, and so a lot of us can get to a point where we look at that conditioning of our family, of our society, and our culture, and realize, like, simple things like, do I need to own this much stuff, or what stuff really has value to me, as well as look at the conditioning of our family about if we want children or how we care to live our lives, what jobs we have, all of that sort of stuff. We can start to break down those superficial and kind of mid-depth level notions of goodness as they come under our conditioning of what is expected of us externally to achieve or appear like in order to fit this notion of societal good. So to put this part more simply, I will sum up and say that some people may not think that I am a good person because while I buy stuff, I certainly don't buy a lot of stuff. And so, or I buy stuff that has value or that I need in my life, or I really sit with if I really truly want. And so for some people, that might not make me a good person because I am not participating in the economy, so to speak, like some people would expect me to, or some people would expect in their considerations of external good. So we get to the more complex level, the deeper level of this consideration of, does spiritual awakening make you a good person? And again, we need to unpack those ideas of goodness. Because, for example, we need to consider the thought of perfectionism here. Is that so many people are caught in this idea that they need to be perfect. Basically, they need to be inhuman. I work with so many people who, as children, were conditioned to be perfect. And what that meant, according to their parents, that they were perfect and therefore good was for them to take up as little space as possible, for them to essentially, in some cases, disappear, to not have a voice, not have wants, not have any needs, especially any wants or needs that would be different from the family system as a whole. And so a whole lot of people are struggling in the world with this thought that they are a burden, that they are not good, that they are somehow wrong, that everything that they do is wrong, because during their childhood experience, their parents, the school system, and others made them feel that way because they had needs that maybe were different than others, or because them having any needs or wants at all would mean that the parents or school system would actually have to put in some effort, actually have to do some work, actually need to tend to their children. And so I will offer some grace for parents that when you have a child that is quite different from you, meeting them on their level is certainly a consideration. Many parents I work with do this beautifully, but there are a lot of parents that just have a child that is unlike them and don't know what to do with them. And so feelings of that divide can certainly be picked up by the child and be sort of conditioned or be brought into the system of the child as there being something immensely wrong or broken about them. And again, this pattern of invisibility and perfection, meaning not needing anybody else, not having any needs, wants, not kind of appearing in reality, so to speak, not taking up space. And then we work our way to kind of larger forms of conditioning yet again, that we have all of these religious and spiritual thoughts that come through by culture, by tradition, sometimes, quite explicitly, rules, edicts, all that sort of stuff that teach us what we need to do to be a good person, to be a moral person. And so I will say that many of these offer really wonderful understandings and guidelines. But what happens when you awaken, when you go through, when I talk about spiritual awakening, I talk about it as being kind of a multi-layered process where most people are in a stage, kind of a first stage of working through their own stuff. And then they may go into the second stage, which is working out how they relate to larger conditioning, culture, ancestry, country, all of that sort of stuff. And on this level, and going into the third stage, which tends to be a bit more philosophical and talking about um, kind of beliefs and basic understandings and divisions of reality that we've taken on. So in the second and third phase, we may start to question the sort of religious conditioning that we've grown up with, that's become a part of our programming, and break through that. And so I will say that a lot of people who are not at that point yet, they need these rules. There's a reason why we need laws, why we need rules, why we need this religious and spiritual conditioning, because if it were not there, some people are not yet at the point of considering like, hey, maybe I shouldn't do harm to others. Hey, maybe I shouldn't participate in this behavior or do this sort of thing. What you will find, though, is that sometimes, unfortunately, people really cling to these things. And what happens in those cases is that every other viewpoint, every other consideration of goodness of morality that opposes their own very tight, controlled notions of things is horrible and evil, that their way is the only way, it is the right way. And you will see this just as much as you will with spirituality and kind of spiritual but not religious paths as you will with um, heavily traditional or more orthodox religious paths. So to sum up that last part, I will say that religious and spiritual conditioning can offer us notions of goodness that are incredibly helpful to us as we are beginning awakening, or if we are not awakened. But gradually we can get to a point where we no longer cling to those things, where we can question them, where we can move into a phase of individuation, which is considering our own concepts of right and wrong, our own concepts of morality, and our own concepts of how we wish to lead our lives. And if it is that at that point that we can truly experience freedom and greater consciousness rather than spending our lives following and clinging to rules and thoughts that may be quite helpful, or they may sort of corral us into a corner that is not helpful to guide us, to lead us to a place of greater consciousness. So, on the deepest layer of things here, when we're considering this whole discussion about does spiritual awakening make you a good person, we need to talk about the concept of moral superiority and what I call the loop of moral superiority. If you look at my work in my books, The Body Deva, as well as my book, Shadow Work for the Soul, I talk about loops. And so loops are the personal and collective patterns that we keep on going through again and again. And on a personal level, we may notice we're having the same conversations again and again, or getting into the same situation, or encountering the same type of person who upsets us in a particular way. Those are all loops. And what they are guiding us to is areas in our life that are static. We are creatures of flow. And those static points, those loops, show us areas that we can break free from, that it would be helpful to break free from for further awakening. Also, collectively, we have loops um, that we go through, that many people go through. And so, one of those loops very much has to do with moral superiority and the enormous, enormous shadow that this casts. There is a point during awakening where, like I talked about, this conditioning starts to crumble. You start to consider on a personal level what works for you, what your values and beliefs are. But not only that, when people are in earlier stages of awakening, there tends to be a bit of naivete. And this can be a wonderful type of innocence, a wonderful type of like childlike consideration of reality, how we wish reality to be. Um, and rather than seeing reality clearly for how it is, because if we're able to see reality clearly for how it is, we will see it as pretty heartbreaking. We will see the darker nature of humans. We will start to see the darker nature of ourselves. And what happens when we truly embody spirituality is that eventually we come into contact with the darker aspects of self, with our instincts, and we experience what is known as an atavistic resurgence. And so, put simply, I've done some videos on this already, but we come into contact with our fight, flight, or freeze, as well as fawn and flaccid responses. So those are our basic survival instincts. And many of us who are spiritual may wish to be more passive or maybe stuck in one of those instincts and not respond to others. For example, we may be stuck in a fawn instinct and not have the capacity to fight. We may be stuck in a fight instinct and not have the capacity to kind of go into that healthy attach response where we can listen to the people around us and take in their insights and look at them as a fellow human being, all that sort of good stuff. And so during spiritual awakening, you can get to a point where these instincts free themselves within us. And put simply, this means that we can make a conscious decision about how to act and react in situations instead of having our stuck instinct respond for us. For example, always go into a freeze state, always go into a fight state, or having our past emotions or trauma or ego and its defenses sort of lead us into responsiveness. We can encounter somebody and make a conscious decision about if we want to walk away, if we want to chat with them, if we want to argue with them, or if we want to punch them in the face. All of those can be freed within us, and we should have access to every single aspect of ourselves in our wholeness. And yes, having access to all parts of ourselves in all of our wholeness means accessing the darker aspects of ourselves. As humans, we have the capacity to do great harm. And part of what having superiority means is that it is an enormous defense against seeing the aspects of ourselves that are not perfect, that are not good, that are in fact are quite animalistic and dark. So let's talk about the loop of moral superiority. You could get to a point where, in spiritual awakening, where you truly recognize that quote from Shakespeare I included in my shadow workbook that, all the world's a stage and all the men and women on it are players. And you can start to see these loops more clearly. And a lot of these loops take up so much of our energy and time. And they are just sort of ego competitions, ego games that we play out, that are not true reality. They, in fact, are keeping us from true reality. And I've talked about the superiority inferiority loop in some of my previous videos. I talk about it in my shadow workbook as well. But today I'm going to talk about the loop of moral superiority. Someone who is unwilling to look at themselves, unwilling to look at their true nature, which doesn't include just light, just the good, morally superior aspects of self, is continually going to be in a stage of casting that shadow out into the world and out into others. So what does this look like? This looks like somebody at the extreme end who spends their days talking about how everybody else is evil and terrible and horrible, how people are like this, how everybody else is like this, how this group, how this religion, tradition, way of being, lifestyle, diet, how that is evil, bad, not good. And so the person who is in this place where they need to do this is doing this because it creates this enormous wall, this enormous barrier around them energetically, in which all of the bad in the world is outside of themselves. If they were to question why they need to be in such judgment, in such harshness, in such division with other people, because a good basic understanding of spiritual awakening is that it moves into oneness states, into states of union, where there are no longer divisions. And so that definition alone can cause for us to question notions of goodness, notions of moral superiority, notions of clinging on to anything from um, rules to conspiracy theories to whatever parts of ourselves are still participating in that play in which other people, other beliefs, under other understandings, other ways of being in reality are horrible and awful. Because when we push out all of that darkness into the world, the reason that we are doing it and creating such an energetic barrier is because it prevents us from feeling. It prevents us from navigating the gray and especially the dark places within ourselves. It prevents us from recognizing our own ignorance, our own divisions, and our own darkness. I really loved existentialism for a long period of time. And the reason that I'm mentioning this is because philosophically, we can talk about humans as not being these tremendous beings of light and not necessarily being our worst or basest instincts, but of occupying this space of ambiguity, of sort of grayness, of nuance. And I love that thought because when we can get to a place of self-recognition, when we start taking our shadows back, I'm going to recommend my book, Shadow Work for the Soul, to do this. But when we start taking our shadows back, when we start taking all of those projections that we put onto reality, onto other people, we start taking back and recognizing and realizing our own ignorance, our own self-hatred, our own self-loathing that we've put onto the world. In the case of moral superiority, when we start to recognize that within ourselves contains darkness, contains the possibility and capacity to do great harm in this world. What happens, especially when we take this back, is that we can recognize that that moral superiority loop was a front. It was a way for us to not navigate, to prevent ourselves from navigating the darker spaces within ourselves, to contend with the parts of ourselves that truly can do harm. And what happens when we start to take back all of that darkness is that we come more into wholeness. Ironically, we come more into the light. Um, we contain both darkness and light. I will always say this, looking at the basic yin yang symbol, we are half darkness, half light, as long as we are still divided. And so what happens is that we need to take back all of our darkness. We need to take back all of our light. And then those two can combine and we can move beyond duality, move into oneness fully and completely. But we can't do that without claiming our darkness. And the clearest way to see our unclaimed darkness is to look at the moral superiority loop in ourselves. Most frequently, people need to look at it in the outer world first and see other people doing this and see how it is such a method of defense. Um, if other people are evil, I'm not evil. If other people are dark, I'm not dark. If other people are hateful and spiteful and horrible and evil and bad, then I do not need to accept those things within myself. When you do accept all those things within yourself, that need for more moral superiority, that loop, and all of the energy that we put into it, because we put so much energy and time into our egos trying to assert themselves to blind us from our own self-hatred, our own self-loathing, our own capacities towards darkness. Our ego really is defending ourselves against further self-recognition and self-realization. When we can't accept all parts of ourselves is that that play stops. We can stop participating in it. We can let go of it fully. And we can move into places where we no longer need to divide ourselves. So, does spiritual awakening make somebody a good person? Not in the very contained way that people tend to think, in the moral superiority way that people tend to think of good people. That is akin to a type of perfectionism, a type of ideal that is not human. Even if we are the most realized person on earth, we are going to have days that we are tired, that we are grouchy, that we are very, very human. And self-realization leads to becoming more human and thus imperfect. And so letting go of this notion, this very tightly contained notion of perfectionism, idealism, of moral superiority, of this thought that people will occupy this certain rarefied air if they're awakened, uh, isn't quite accurate. What is more accurate is that when we have contained, accepted, realized the full continuum, darkest dark to lightest light of who we are, is that we can make choices, conscious decisions about how we lead our lives. And those conscious decisions tend to be ones that embrace our own power rather than taking the power of others, and tend to contain a lot of awareness of the ripple effects of our actions and reactions in the world. And so when you are aware of that ripple effect of your own reactions and actions in the world, you tend to realize that you don't wish to, you know, punch people in the face energetically or physically, even though you might have the capacity to. Spiritual awakening also, at the end of the day, removes disconnection and goes into states of union, goes into states of eventually the spiritual heart opening, which is where we really experience reality as one whole. And so, in that, with people I meet, I do not view them as separate from me. I do not view them as somebody that I am in battle against anymore. Uh, any conflicts that arise outside of the self can be something I can look at within myself, sort of thing. And when you get to that level of awareness, there tends to be more positive affect, more positive regard for other people, because there no longer are those conflicts and battles within yourself that you are projecting onto other people. So to end, I will talk a little bit about, well, then, how come realized people sometimes do harm? And the answer to this is complicated, but I will simplify it. In order to become where most people are is struggling with their childhood stuff, with their childhood conditioning, patterns, trauma, energies. If you look at my chakra videos, basically first, second chakra is where most people, even people who are awakening, are still perceiving reality from. And so somebody who gets out of that is going to be in the minority in terms of people overall, the third chakra and up, so to speak, awareness. And so it is easy at that perspective to have perspective, but not have the totality of perspective. So somebody can be quite realized, and what happens through realization is interesting because you go through these tests of power, these tests of capacity, but also as you are working through your own individuation, your own self-realization, is that you heal all these aspects of yourself. You resolve all these aspects of yourself. And so you can be on the threshold of the brink of something, but not be in the totality of the spiritual heart. If somebody is truly within the spiritual heart, the capacity or desire to harm others, to take advantage of others, to do predatory behavior towards others, that all releases. But somebody can be quite realized, or somebody can believe that they are realized and tell other people that. Um, and gain a large following, and they can have quite amount of good go out into the world. Um, but they are not yet at a place of total union with reality. One of the sort of odd things about spiritual awakening is that you work through all of this dark stuff. And when you get to a point where you are truly looking at what is separating you from reality, what is separating you from the spiritual heart, what is separating you from experience true union, is that sort of base, grimy, sort of, ocean floor level of self-hatred, self-loathing, the capacity to recognize ourselves as quite dark, and our animalistic selves, our primal selves. This is a place where plenty of people have faltered. And so the simplest way I can describe this is that if somebody is, you know, 80%, 90%, 99% awakened, that 1% can be enormously dark that they have not faced. That 20% becomes quite a shadow because they may not be looking at it first of all, but also that ripple effect I'm talking about is that when we create harm for others, we are creating harm for ourselves. It ripples backward and forward, and we become more and more aware of those energies. Um, it is just that some of us may be at 90% or 80% or, 60% and not wishing to look at the 40% because especially when you go into a place where people are considering you a spiritual teacher or a guru, you're having a lot of energies projected at you. And there can be a lessening of a desire to look at yourself because it is difficult to take that sort of personal responsibility. It is difficult to wish to look at the really dark aspects of self, um, to respond to them. So feel free to write your thoughts below about, does spiritual awakening make you a good person? Feel free to share below if you've noticed the moral superiority loop in yourself and others. And I hope that this has served you in some way.